Okay, so hi, welcome to the second episode of Democracy Talk, and I'm Yoram talking with Patrick, and today we'll be talking about Patrick. I'll be asking Patrick a few questions about himself, about his past, his book, and his opinions, ideas, maybe about what he's doing right now. And hopefully we'll find some interesting things to talk about, and this will kind of cover our introduction, right? In the first episode, Patrick asked about me. This will be me asking about Patrick, and hopefully after that we'll feel that the ground is clear to move on to other things. Okay, so hi Patrick.
Good afternoon, Yoram. How are you doing?
I'm good, and you?
I'm well, thank you.
Great. So, Patrick, I've read your book, Fraudcast News, and which, as you mentioned last time, is also available online as a PDF, and so everybody can read it. It covers the book. I found it very interesting. It covers your history as a reporter, and it kind of describes how you got to be what you are today. So for those people who didn't read the book, could you kind of give a short summary?
Yeah, of course. I struggled with the ideas of journalism and democracy as a professional journalist. And they are quite, for many people, very esoteric, very specialist, and ordinary people don't really want to get into the details of media and democracy in any great detail. They'll talk about it in a general way and then sort of switch off. And I worked for 11 years with Reuters, the news agency, and over the course of 11 years, I became disenchanted with conventional journalism as practiced at Reuters, but as I could see was also practiced amongst my colleagues and my peers around me. And at the same time, even a principal driver of why I was unhappy with conventional journalism is because as a journalist, I was frequenting politicians and decision makers. I was putting questions to them. I was hearing them answer other people's questions. I was watching decision-making processes and how proposals for law were evolving. And I felt as the more I knew, the less I liked the process. I was in Brussels for 5 years, so I watched the European Union at work. I was in the UK in financial markets. I was doing a bit of UK news. I was then out in Southeast Asia and Malaysia, again, watching politics, watching decision-making. And so I didn't really like what I was seeing in terms of the practicalities of decision-making, so politics, government, democracy, whatever you would have it called as shorthand. And I thought that both my work and the work of my peers as journalists was extremely poor at saying, our decision-making processes are rubbish. This is not a way to be making law. And I tried to interest my editors in that. And most of the time, the editors were sort of saying, pat, nice idea, yes, now get back to, what we want you to do, which is writing about GDP or growth or the nuts and bolts of electoral horse races, who's up, who's down, all the usual stuff. They don't want to talk about the idea that we don't really live in a democracy at all. We don't live in democracy. This is that's way too radical and it's also too complicated. Don't do that, get back to your day job. And that was very frustrating for me. So Fraudcast News is 220 pages, which talks about my dream as a sort of late teenager of getting into journalism, being a journalist, falling out of love with journalism, and how I learned about democracies not being democracies. And then I wrote the book. And that was really the book in a nutshell.
Uh-huh. Okay. So you said that. Okay. So it appears that there are two subjects here, right? There is the journalism, and there is the politicians that you covered as a journalist. And you said that you were, it appeared to you that that the process of government and government itself was not as it should be, is not as it is usually presented. What is exactly the connection between that and journalism? I mean, why is it? I mean, it appears maybe that you were saying both of them are dysfunctional. Both government and journalism are dysfunctional, right? Is there a connection between those two dysfunctions, or are they happen to be dysfunctional at the same time?
Well, I mean, you're correct in terms of, I link them together. If you look at the title, it's Fraudcast News, but it's actually how bad journalism supports our bogus democracies. So in my mind, as a professional journalist, they are intimately linked, and they're intimately linked for a number of reasons. The only purpose for me of journalism is to be a servant of civil society. So journalists should be going to decision makers, or going to situations, or analyzing situations, spending a lot of time looking at them, finding things out in terms of what's happening, and then presenting that to their fellow citizens. So journalists should be at the service of civil society. They should be conduits of understanding, really. That's the idea of a journalist, is like, go and find something out, come back and tell us, and give us an idea about the sort of different things we might think about having to take decisions about in order to sort something out. That's sort of a journalist's job. And so I was going, as a journalist, in my mind, to watch these people who were making law, basically, for us, human beings, citizens. And I was looking, because my background is actually in engineering, I was looking at the process of making law. And I wanted to get into the realities of how laws are made. And this could be all sorts of laws. And the more I got into the process, the more I felt that it was very, very unrepresentative of humanity as a whole. And I suppose the way it first came up, there was a very clear example of when I was in Brussels. I was the Reuters environment correspondent in Brussels, and the environment ministers, the European Union environment ministers, were talking about putting a tax on carbon as a way of combating climate change. And this is in the 1990s, so this is 20 years ago plus. And they had maybe 18 months of debate over a series of meetings talking about whether the European Union as a bloc would have a carbon tax, so that people would have to pay something related to climate change in order to use fossil fuels. And, it had its imperfections, the process, but they got a deal amongst environment ministers. It then went to finance ministers and to heads of state and government, because that's the process in the European Union. And basically, the finance minister said, nah, and that was it. And so I was sort of thinking, I've followed this process for months, and I've followed the debate, and I can see why it's useful. And then it gets to the finance minister, and they say no, and the heads of state and government who don't even sort of care. And it's sort of, the information comes back to us as journalists in a sort of little footnote in a press release. And you sort of think, this isn't the way to make law. This is not the way to make law. And not only that, this is in some of the countries that would claim to be the most advanced democracies in the world. And this is how they're making law. And so as a journalist, I was saying, this is rubbish. And then I was sort of thinking, looking around me and talking to my peers, and they were saying, I was saying, this is rubbish. And they were sort of, well, not interested. And my editors weren't interested. And so for many years, these sort of questions of lawmaking and we should be paying attention was sort of there in my sort of mind. And I had no one really to talk to them about. About them, and no one seemed to think that they were issues. And this sort of gradually grew over years in London, and then in Malaysia, and then back in London. And eventually I just gave up. I negotiated a redundancy from Reuters, and I got out, and I did exactly the right thing, actually. I was really lucky. They paid me to leave, and I went off and I wrote my book.
I see. So you basically, I think you're saying that the connection between those two things is that if journalism was doing its job, then it would be more difficult for government to be this dysfunctional?
Definitely. That's in a nutshell, Yoram. I mean, if journalism was doing its job, then journalists would never write the word democracy without inverted commas around it. You know, we don't live in democracies. We go back to, again, as an engineer, when I realized that I didn't really know what democracy meant, this is as a professional journalist, I went back to first principles. Okay, what does it mean? You know, demos, kratos, government by the people. And then you think, well, is this government by the people? There are other Greek words for what we live in, and it's more like oligarchy, or could be even kleptocracy, or, you know, whatever. But it's certainly not democracy. And so if journalists were doing their job, when politicians use the word democracy, they would laugh at them and they would say, come on, Prime Minister, that's absurd. This isn't a democracy. This is an oligarchy. You know, they would be writing in their pieces, we do not live in democracies. So that the debate that you have been trying to be part of through equality by lot would be so much easier to have, because people would be saying, we have a massive crisis because we do not live in democracy. We do not allow our politicians to use these words or our journalists to write them because we don't live in democracy.
Okay, so so basically, again, if we're talking about the sorry for kind of hammering on this point.
No, that's fine.
So if we're talking about the connection between those two things, journalism or non-democratic media, non-representative media, which just means not representing the interests of the people at large, right? Is an enabler of non-representative government, right?
Precisely, and so the two go together, and the two have arrived at the same level of dysfunction for the same sorts of reasons. You know, you're talking about elite capture. I'm British, so when I look at the British main political parties, so you have Labour, you have Conservative, and then there's a third party, the Liberal Democrats, who are largely discredited, having been in a coalition with the Conservatives and changed some of their fundamental positions as soon as they got into a power-sharing coalition. But if you look fundamentally at Labour and the Conservatives, even with the new Labour leader who's there, Jeremy Corbyn, but he's untested as yet, so it's an open question, but my suspicions is he's not going to be that radical, then you're getting offered very similar fare from both parties, and they are so-called left and so-called right. But this is so much sand in our faces as human beings, as society, because you know, what is right, what is left? Someone who might be so-called right on one issue might be left on something else. It's such a black and white 1-0 that allows our division rather than our education. So there's elite capture in politics, and the people who are politicians are a particular species, and they do tend to be male and, you know, a certain age and a certain wealth and a certain education. And journalism features not quite to the same extent, but the same sort of problems. And these elite groups, they meet together and they live in an elite world, and so they suffer from elite thinking. And in fact, this fellow, Manuel Arriaga, who we've been talking about, he's written this book, Rebooting Democracy Here. And he talks about exactly this problem of elite herding. You come together and you start to have a worldview which fits with the elite amongst whom you spend your time, but you become further and further removed from ordinary people. And of course, there are exceptions amongst politicians and amongst media, but they are exceptions. They are the tiny few amongst the mass.
Okay, so I guess we'll discuss why government is not representative. You know, we'll discuss that, and also discuss why media is not representative. But for now, I'd like to focus on the second question: why isn't media representative? And let me kind of play the devil's advocate, or kind of play the normal argument, which is you know, media is especially so maybe if you're talking about government operated media, then yes, it just serves the government. But if you're talking about commercial media, then you know, it gives people what they want. If someone gave them something better, something they're more interested in, then they would watch them or read them or listen to them. So the fact, so you basically you're coming and saying, you know, all of you people who manage to you know, manage to capture the interests of or the attention of the public, you're not doing you're not, you know, you're failing, but they are very successful, right? They manage to do exactly what they set out to do, which is to get people interested. So why isn't it actually working?
Well, there's a difference. Sorry, excuse me, I'm just going to clear my throat. You know, there's a difference between offering a commercial product and providing information to people which will allow them to understand issues better. So we talk about conventional media, and that encapsulate state broadcasters, and for me that includes people like the BBC, the British state broadcaster, but it also includes the commercial media. But they're talking ultimately about a commercial product. So it's trying to pull people in to watch their channel, and it's not trying to give people information about their societies. And those two things are not the same. So you can't have an informed citizenship or a citizenry purely on the basis of a state broadcaster and commercial media, because where I came to this was when I was inside it, people would make comments to me about me as being in the conventional media, and I would think, you know, I'm a nice guy, I'm an honest guy, I'm doing the best I can, and yeah, we don't always get it right, but you know I'm honest, and I am honest, and my colleagues were honest too. But you are living inside this bubble, which means that you can't actually see what people are seeing from outside. And it was only as I was leaving Reuters that in 2005 that I came across Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, and his book. And you know, there are many different analyses.
I think you were just cut out. So could you repeat the Chomsky's book? The name of Chomsky's book.
So Chomsky and Herman, they are the name of the book is Manufacturing Dissent.
Consent.
Sorry, Manufacturing Consent. Yes. And in that book, Chomsky talks about five filters that make the media behave the way they do. And there are filters like ownership. So the ownership of a media operation will influence the output of that media operation. And in that instance, you have privately owned, so a commercial, i.e. could be quoted on a stock exchange or owned by an individual, or state. And obviously with the state, you're going to have political pressures, which if you spend any time looking at the BBC, you can see there's huge political pressures on the BBC, which influences their editorial output. You have the ideology, or the political thinking, to use a softer term, of the people who are in the media, so the journalists. And if you have that bias that I was talking about before, if they tend to be male, they tend to be a certain age, they tend to be a certain education, all these sort of things, then those biases are there, that you can't escape them. The journalists talk about objectivity as opposed to subjectivity, and that's a total myth. You know, we're all subjective human beings. We can't escape the subjectivities of our birth, the time we were born, the education we've had, the people we're around, you know, et cetera, et cetera. We are subjective. So there's ideology, there's ownership, there is flack, which is if I'm a media organization and I put out reports that are too challenging to the status quo, then you will see a lot of blowback against your media channel. There is sourcing, which comes really from journalistic training, which is this, and it's related to notions of objectivity. If you're going to be objective, then you have to get all sides, as it were, of an argument. And this has been very evident with, for example, climate change. Climate change, if you look at climate scientists, it's in the high 90s of climate scientists, either people who know about atmospheres and chemical models and what happens and physical models, who are convinced that of human-induced climate change. And then there's, of the order of either a fraction of a percent or in the low, very low single-digit percentage points of climate scientists who think that it's not true. But it's minute. And yet the coverage of climate change is that for a long time, maybe it's slightly less now, a long time it's been, there are doubts about this. People say, but people say this. And that's this idea of sourcing, you need to get both sides of the story, which is hogwash. The story was it's climate change and we should be doing something about it. And why are we not doing something about it? Rather than there's some sort of question about science. So that's a third filter. We've got ownership, we've got ideology, we've got flack, we've got
sourcing, you said?
Sourcing is the other one, and I've lost the other one. That's why we do. That's why we do live producing. So the notion.
Sorry. I don't. I mean, I understand. We'll definitely go back to discuss all of those issues. But I guess what I'm missing here is, okay, so there are all of those issues with every media channel. Why is it that there aren't good media channels around, or at least if there are, why are they so why are they so, I wouldn't say unpopular, but they're not dominant? Why do they only capture a niche of the attention?
Well, there are all the pressures in media that you see in other realms of business, which is concentration. The whole process of globalization has been one of concentration. Globalization is a nice fluffy word. Monopolization would be possibly a more accurate one. I mean, I was just reading this afternoon about Monsanto and Bayer. So Monsanto and Bayer are crop chemicals companies. Monsanto, I think, is worth about 42 billion, Bayer something like 90 billion. And there are only really a handful of crop chemical, crop seed companies in the world. And Bayer is trying to buy Monsanto. And so the notion of international finance, capital markets, is one of concentration. And so if you are not big, you will get eaten. And if you are of a certain size, then you probably need to eat smaller competitors in order not to get eaten yourself. So media are subject to exactly the same commercial pressures as a chemicals company or a bank or anything. And so you see it again and again of either smaller media being put out of business or just being absorbed into a bigger beast, as it were. Reuters was still Reuters when I worked for it. It's now Thomson Reuters. It was bought by the North American business news group. So it's now Thomson Reuters, and that is the dynamic of media. But and I have, like some well-prepared sort of cook, I brought some other stuff here. There are magazines. This is Resurgence and The Ecologist, which Resurgence is sort of 50 years old, looking at environmental issues. There's another one, which is, alternative media. There's another one here, which is a British one, Positive News. They're sort of looking at, I can keep it there, they're looking at notions of constructive journalism. And whilst it's relatively small, what's interesting about Positive News is they had a very successful crowdfunding campaign just in the last year or so, in which they sort of got double the budget they were looking for. And their model is gaining traction, the notion of constructive journalism rather than what is the conventional journalism tends to be encapsulated in, if it bleeds, it leads, i.e. we do bad news rather than good news, which there's no real psychological reason for, because you can present facts that happen in very different ways. And the tendency of journalism up until recently has been that this idea of if it bleeds, it leads. So earthquakes and volcanoes and plane crashes and bad stuff, rather than You know, if you're looking in Germany, for example, which has taken in 1 million refugees last year, there are any number of stories which is refugees and locals successfully integrate, or local people, you know, bring refugees into their home, or any number.
Well, I mean, I would argue that you know, in the business section, usually the success stories get you know, amplified even beyond any real successes. But I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's positive news. There's another one here, which is a British one, which is called Stir Magazine, and that's again, you know, reader funded.
Okay, but Patrick, all of those things surely exist, but still, you know, people, you know, mostly listen to and watch and read a few, you know, right? As you said, right? There's a lot of agglomeration, a lot of monopolization. So with all of those little potential outlets, right? You know, media venues that people could read, yet they still flock to a handful of conglomerates. Why is it?
Well, I mean, it's certainly I mean, flock to is an interesting word, Yoram, because I mean, I'm 50, and if I talk to people who are the next generation, from my perspective, which is say 20-year-olds, you know, maybe they've got a BBC headlines or a Facebook headlines or a Google headlines on their mobile phone, but it comes up alongside sort of YouTube videos and other stuff. It's just mixed into all the possible sort of stimuli that they can have. And in terms of their media habits, they're much more dispersed and mixed up. But at the same time, and maybe it's because I'm an incurable optimist, but the 10 years that I have been turning ideas of media on their head, I would say things are a lot better now than they were 10 years ago. It's much easier to find alternative points of view than it was 10 years ago. And they're getting better as well. And that's also accompanied by loads of people who tell me, so this is anecdotal, I no longer watch the news. You know, it's a complete turnoff. It's lies, it's rubbish, and in fact, they're covering politicians who I don't want to listen to anyway. So, you know, the big success story for the media in the US in this year has been Trump. You know, he says really controversial stuff, and he gets viewers, and he generates attention and either shock or approbation. And you know, the media companies in the States, I think he's fantastic. And so I don't think the conventional media are in such great health. And I think there is a movement both towards notions of things like constructive journalism, but also because the costs of entry are becoming lower. I think we're on the sort of turnaround as far as media are concerned.
Okay, that's interesting. I think we will explore in future episodes. I hope to explore, you know, the facts, right? To see whether this is just a feeling or is there really something there, and you know, we should I really don't know. I mean, on the one hand, there is a lot of stories just like the ones that you say about you know, about all these kind of grassroots initiatives and people ditching, cutting themselves off of cable and so on. On the other hand, there is still a lot of news about media agglomeration, conglomeration, and monopolization. So I think you know, personally, I really don't know what the facts on this issue are, and I'd be happy to find out. So let's put that on our agenda. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Other than that, I think we've gotten some understanding of your background, Patrick, and I think we can call it an episode. And unless you have something that you want to say right now,
I suppose there will be one last thing, Yoram, which is, you know, as I said earlier, I am definitely an optimist. You know, the book is Fraudcast News, as I said, and talks about bad journalism and bogus democracy. But in the conclusions, my sense is that there are upsides to this, both in terms of democracy and also in terms of media. And so I practice citizen journalism myself, so not through commercial journalism of sort of organizations. And I also teach people how to do it as well. And I think that the means to do that are increasingly all around us. And in the same way that I put journalism and democracy together in the book as problems, I see that journalism and democracy go together also as solutions, because we need to grow up as citizens. We need to take responsibility for our politics. And we also need to grow up as users of the media, of people who need information and want to learn things. So rather than just sitting dumb in front of rubbish media, we need to first of all become more media literate, and we also need to learn how to make media. And there's a guy called Dan Gilmore who has written books called We the Media and Media Active, and both of those are free PDFs. And you know, he very much pushes this notion of the media are disastrous, and the response to that should be, we should first of all learn about them ourselves, we should talk about them to our friends, and then we should make media.
Okay, again, something I think we should pursue. I think well, my opinions may be a bit you know, a bit similar and a bit different, and we'll hopefully go through all of these things in upcoming episodes. So thank you very much, and we'll meet again.
Good stuff. Thanks, Yoram.
Bye-bye.